the value of a document was not the document itself, but where it was found, right? So they would find the Bayeux Tapestry in the Bayeux Cathedral because it was magnificent. So therefore, it was a real document, right?
Mm. Yeah.
So they tried to find the Magna Carta by digging it under the painted chamber in Westminster Palace, right? But they got caught and they came up with a better story and backdated it into history, and none of it was real. So when Shakespeare wrote King John, he never mentioned the Magna Carta. And then when it was when that author died and it was updated and rewritten by Sir Walter Raleigh, he never mentioned the Magna Carta. And when his cousin Viscount Francis Bacon got Raleigh's Shakespeare and got some of the esoteric words with many meanings and deep meanings and changed them slightly into words with less meaning, but more understandable, he also didn't mention the Magna Carta, right? Mm-hmm. So King John never saw the Magna Carta in his lifetime, and it was Sir Robert Daring, who was a convicted criminal for document fraud. He got the Magna Carta, supposedly, the second copy, and he delivered it to Sir Robert Cotton, who was in prison for the second time for document fraud, right? And then Sir Robert Cotton put it in the Cotton Library, his own library, right, as a real document. So he now had two Magna Cartas in the Cotton Library in the 1620s, 1629 and 1630. And the Magna Carta was actually brought into Britain. It was never in England. It was brought into Britain in 1622, and they're wondering what to do with it, right? What's the biggest scam they could do with it? So they brought it into the Cotton Library, and then King Charles I stole the Cotton Library. King Charles II had it, and then he gave it to Sir Robert Cotton's grandson once Sir Robert Cotton had died and his son had died, so no one knew what was real or not. There's no continuity. And then as soon as Sir Robert Cotton's the convicted fraudster, twice convicted fraudster, as soon as his grandson had it, he immediately bequeathed it to the nation, having never checked it and having no ability to check it. So there's this massive discontinuity where the Magna Carta was never seen between 1215 and 1737, I think it was. It was the first time it was on display, only for a day or so, and then it was on display again from like 1851. And in between, in 1837, one of the Magna Cartas was actually burnt. They burnt it because if they can show a charred rubble of something, it looks really old. Oh, they just saved that Magna Carta, but you can't read it, right? They can't compare it with the other Magna Carta. So there were four Magna Cartas. So we're talking about historicism here, made up history. There were four Magna Cartas, and none of them were the original. None of them were a copy of the original. None of them were an exemplification of the original, which means all nice lettering. None of the originals existed. None of them had the seals of the king or the barons on it. And none of them were the original draft. One of them was, and none of them were a copy of the original draft. One was an exemplification of the draft, right? So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 away from, right? And the exemplification of a copy of the draft had King John's seal on it, which he wouldn't put on a draft. Right? Right? So the whole thing's fake, but they found it in a really good place, Sir Robert Cotton's library, which was actually had more influence than all the rest of the British Library. And all of Sir Robert Cotton's material were Jesuit habilitated documents. Oh, we found this in the Louvre, or we found this in Chartres, right? And they'd bring it over from supposedly France and say it was a French-English document, and then hand it over to the British, and the British would store it for 100 years and not show anyone, have a fire, and then show it again 120 years later. So from 1851, people could start to see the Magna Carta, which was totally fake, but they had this habilitation history of it, right? And we were told to believe it, and they'd even arranged droughts in order to have a place for the signing of the Magna Carta. King John never saw it. The Magna Carta was never in England. It was actually written in Switzerland in 1234 AD, and then at the some abbey in Switzerland. Can't remember the name of it right now. Terrible, terrible. And then it was picked up in Italy and then brought to England in the 1620s by the Earl of Arundel, who was the most treasonous man in English and British history. And the Magna Carta, people go, oh, Magna Carta, because it sounds good, right? It sounds great charter. But it wasn't called the Magna Carta, it was actually called the Charter of Liberties in 1215, 1216, 1218, and then in 1225 again. But then someone made literally a T-tail copy compilation of the various Magna Cartas, which are all fake, right? And said all these nice things on it. But what the Magna Carta actually says is you can pay your tax to the church instead of the king. None of the clergy can be charged for any crime. If the clergy get the earl to build a church for them on the earl's land, that the clergy own that church and the land so that they can graze cattle and sheep and have a garden all around it. And if you have an absconding priest who leaves, the church still owns that church and land in the area around it for 60 years, or the lifetime of 3 priests working that church, whichever is greater, right? So what the earls would do to get around this is they would bury a document under the church that forbid the Eucharist being presented in that church to nullify the priest's contract, right? I mean, it's bizarre. So all our history is about nullifying fake history. Our history is actually about nullifying fake history, right? And then the Magna Carta also says that once the husband dies, the widow has 40 days to leave the house. Doesn't inherit, right? So people say, oh, Magna Carta, wonderful, wonderful. It sounds great. You know, it's all for the people. It's common law. There's actually no common law in the Magna Carta. It's just a bunch of misogynist priests saying they own the world and the king owns nothing, and you can pay your tax to the church, not to them, and the church has total rights over everything, and you can't charge a priest for anything. I mean, It's a disaster document, right? So what we've got, so I want to open up for you to speak about the equivalent in science, is we've got this disaster history that doesn't work at all, and it's all for the church. And I think with science, we've got this disaster science that's all for the church. The church is always destroying good science and then replacing it with bad science, right? So we've got hole in the ozone layer. No, we don't. That was actually caused by Mount Erebus exploding. And the hole in the ozone layer was over Antarctica in New Zealand, and they said it was over the whole world, right? And from that, you've got DuPont's patent for CFCs. That patent was running out in 1978. So then they decided to have a plane crash in Mount Erebus and declaring it a sacred site in Antarctica, so that no one was allowed to go up Mount Erebus and measure that Mount Erebus was producing more CFCs than the rest of the world put together, including all other volcanoes and the human race, right? So then, because the patent was running out, then DuPont comes up with HCFCs, outlaws CFCs, so that Asians can't produce it for cheap, and comes up with HCFCs, which is more expensive and less effective, right? But they've got the patent for the next 50 years, which is 1978 to 2000 and, I can't work it out, 1978 to 20 years, 2028.
2028, yeah.
So in 4 years' time, we'll find DuPont will come up with this next global warming crisis, climate change disaster, so that they can not have the Asian market reproduce HCFCs on the cheap, right? Meanwhile, DuPont, getting on a bit, DuPont funds the American Olympic wrestling team, right? So they go to the Olympics, have a wrestle, come back home, and he's training them again, and he shoots them all. in the wrestling room. He murdered the entire American Olympic wrestling team. It's just nuts crazy, right? So the person behind global warming is this nuts crazy DuPont guy who's still in prison for mass murder. There's 4 or more people is mass murder. And that's what global warming is based on. Now, the UN, etc., doing all this global warming shit, they don't mention this. They don't mention Mount Erebus. They don't mention DuPont's murder of the American Olympic wrestling team. There's actually a movie made on it, right? So it's out there, but do people think? So now we've got global warming. That didn't really work because we had some really cold winters, 2016, 17. So then it became climate change. And then in the summer, it becomes global warming again. And then the winter, it becomes climate change. Spring and autumn, you've got classic seasonal change. So that's climate change. It's actually weather.
Yeah. Weather, yeah.
It's weather.
Just happening, yeah. There is no global weather, it's just like weather is very local, it seems.
Yeah, and what we've got is the total manipulation of the weather to create floods. But at the same time, we've got the Environmental Agency in the UK telling the farmers not to clear their canals, right, and drains. So normally you'd clear your canals and drains and the water would flow out to the sea. And what we've just had is flooding of entire counties, and all of the winter seed that's put in has gone rotten. So we're going to have a food shortage, right? Yeah. And at the same time, we've got Asians, especially, and Islamics, going into supermarkets with, the massive wire trolleys and filling them up to the top, and then going into the self-service section, scanning 2 items, and then paying for those, and then walking out, and the supermarket security letting them through, right? Which means our food prices have risen because we're paying for people stealing the food, and then they've brought in a law that you can't call the police. The police won't respond to a theft unless it's over a certain amount, right? Now, in America, that amount is $950.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you can steal that like every day.
You can steal 900, yeah. You can steal $940 worth of stuff out of a shop, and the shop owners can't call the police, right? So what's happened in San Francisco? This is how bizarre, governments are so bizarre. So all the shops now have had to put all of their produce in locked glass cases. So if you go into a shop now in San Francisco, like a grocery store, you have to find out what you want. Then you have to go and see the shop assistant, and then they'll come over with a lock and key, and they'll pull out a container of ice cream, and then they take it to the counter, and once you've paid the money, they will give you the container of ice cream, right? So instead of going in and out of a shop in 3 minutes, it's now half an hour, right? So people are buying shit off Amazon.
Yeah.
Because it's easier, So that amount of unnecessary difficulty as a chain reaction from the Catholic Church with their non-logic, non-reality, projecting schisms on everything so that we are hard-laboured, right? And then what happens out of that is the farmers can't grow their food. The supermarkets won't pay the farmers because they're not getting paid. Our food prices go up, and we don't have any food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's like a technique of war, right? To go for the food supply. If you want to weaken a nation, attacking the food supply is like...
Yeah. So do you know what the real cause of all that is? Global warming.
Mm-hmm. On the bogeyman, just like with the virus,